Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of precision. It feels sort of like engineering.
Right, yeah, you want that clear answer.
Exactly. You fall off a bike, your arm swells up, you go to the hospital, and the X-ray shows that stark, jagged white line across the bone. The doctor just points to the illuminated screen and says, there it is. That's the break.
It's comforting, in a strange way. We are biologically wired to crave that kind of binary certainty, We want the world to be visible, measurable, and, well, fundamentally categorizable.
Broken or not broken,
Yeah.
solid or fractured.
Exactly, solid or not.
It gives us a foundation to stand on. But when you step into the world of ancient Madhyamaka philosophy, specifically what we're going to explore today, suddenly that X-ray machine is like severely malfunctioning.
Oh, totally breaking down.
You're standing in the dark, the light board is flickering, and the solid bones of reality, the things we literally thought were the absolute, irreducible building blocks of the universe, they start looking incredibly murky.
Murky is probably the polite way to put it. For anyone seriously engaging with this text, it is closer to an existential freefall.
Yeah.
We aren't just questioning the diagnosis here. We are completely deconstructing the very tools, the very concepts that the human mind uses to diagnose reality in the first place.
Which brings us to the mission for today. Welcome back to the deep dive. It is so good to have you with us again. And I want to speak directly to you, our listener, as a peer and, a fellow learner on this journey. We know that you've already navigated the really intense logical deconstructions of the previous 4 chapters. You've walked through the dismantling of causality, the absolute physics of motion, perception, and the aggregates of the self.
Which is no small feat.
Seriously. So you are fully primed for the profound paradigm shift waiting for us today.
Navigating those first 4 chapters is, well, it's the prerequisite. It strips away the macroscopic illusions. But what we are doing today requires an even deeper willingness to let go of deeply ingrained cognitive habits.
Right. Because today we are focusing exclusively on Chapter 5 of Nāgārjuna's foundational masterpiece, the Mūlamadhyamakakārikā, or just the MMK.
Yeah, that's Chapter 5.
It's titled Elements and Defining Characteristics. And our goal is to rigorously apply the universal Madhyamaka diagnostic reasoning to something called the dhātus.
That specific term dhātu is really the absolute center of gravity for this entire discussion. We need to lock down exactly what we mean when we use it.
And based on our sources, I need to establish a very strict conceptual constraint for our conversation today. When Nāgārjuna talks about these dhātus, the irreducible elements of reality like space, earth, water, fire, wind, and consciousness, we have to force our minds to think of them strictly as invisible basic components.
Yes, the absolute basic components of reality. This is a vital boundary to set.
Like invisible atoms, right?
Exactly. If we don't hold this constraint, the entire philosophical argument of Chapter 5 will just feel trivial or obvious to you.
Right. So to be perfectly clear to everyone listening, we are talking about the subatomic level, the bedrock. We must not compare these irreducible elements to macroscopic composite things.
Right, don't picture a piece of wood.
Exactly. Do not picture the wood that makes up your desk. Do not picture a car or a mountain. We are zooming all the way in, past the cells, past the molecules, down to the absolute base layer of existence. The invisible building blocks.
To understand why Nāgārjuna is attacking these invisible building blocks, you really have to understand who he was arguing against. He was engaging directly with the Abhidharma schools of thought.
Okay, so who were they?
Well, these Abhidharma philosophers were not naive. They were incredibly sophisticated phenomenologists. They already completely agreed that a wooden table was an illusion.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah. They knew that a chariot or a house or even a human body was just a composite structure, like a temporary arrangement of smaller parts.
So they were already on board with the idea that the macroscopic world is somewhat empty or fluid.
Yes, they were. But they drew a hard, non-negotiable line in the sand at the dhātus.
At the subatomic level.
Exactly. They argued that if you mathematically or conceptually zoomed in far enough, if you kept breaking reality down into smaller and smaller pieces, you would eventually hit a rock-bottom, irreducible, solid building block.
An element that possessed its own absolute independent reality.
Yes. Inherent existence.
They thought they had found the jagged white line on the X-ray, like the final irreducible pixel of the universe.
Precisely. They believed that these invisible basic components were the ultimate frozen foundation of reality. They called this inherent existence svabhāva.
Svabhāva.
Right.
And Nāgārjuna steps up in Chapter 5 and basically says, no, Even your bedrock is an illusion. Even the absolute foundation is empty.
So how does he actually prove that? Because, I mean, intuitively our brains scream that there has to be a bottom layer.
Right, our brains demand a foundation. There has to be a foundational brick. So to initiate this diagnostic, we need to look at how the mind categorizes these foundational bricks. The sources talk about a specific philosophical triad that we naturally use whenever we try to understand an element. Can you map out this triad for us?
Sure. Whenever our dualistic human minds attempt to analyze reality, we inherently carve things up into three distinct spheres.
Three spheres, okay.
We've seen similar triads in earlier chapters, like the actor, the action, and the result. But in Chapter 5, we are dealing specifically with the triad of characterization or definition.
Okay, the triad of definition. What are the three parts?
First, you have the defining characteristic. This is the subject or the property. In Sanskrit, this is called the lakṣaṇa.
Lakṣaṇa, got it.
For instance, if we were talking about the element of space, the defining characteristic would be the concept of extension or lack of obstruction.
So the defining characteristic is the property we observe. Okay. What's the second sphere?
The second is the action of defining or characterizing. This is the dynamic relation, the verb, the conceptual bridge that connects the property to the object.
The actual process of defining.
Exactly. And that leads to the third sphere, the characterized irreducible element itself. This is the object, the dhātu, the fundamental building block.
So in our example, this is the invisible basic component known as space.
Yes. So to put it simply, we have extension as the characteristic, the active conceptual process of characterizing, and the invisible basic element of space that is receiving the characterization.
Okay. And the Abhidharma view held that this irreducible element, this invisible building block, stands completely alone.
That was their claim. They believed it holds its own reality from its own side, completely independent of our minds, independent of the characteristic, independent of everything. It just inherently is.
But let me pause you right there, because if I'm a listener trying to map this onto my basic understanding of how the universe works, this is where I get completely tripped up. Well, if these invisible basic components of reality are truly fundamental, how can we even conceptually separate the element from its defining characteristic? I mean, isn't an atom just synonymous with its properties?
Walk me through your thought process on that.
Okay, if I have an invisible fundamental particle, and a physicist tells me it has a specific mass and a specific charge, isn't the particle just that mass and charge?
Right. I see where you're going.
If you take away the heat from a fundamental particle of fire, you don't have a cold particle of fire left over. You have nothing. So how can the Abhidharma philosophers, or anyone, really talk about the element and the characteristic as two separate spheres in a triad?
That question cuts right to the heart of the cognitive trap Nāgārjuna is exposing. You are pointing out that, in reality, they shouldn't be separable.
Exactly.
But the problem isn't reality. The problem is our language, our grammar, and, well, the way our biological edge detection software is wired.
What do you mean by our grammar?
Think about how we are forced to speak. Our language requires a noun and an adjective, a subject and a predicate.
Oh, I see.
We are forced by the structure of our own cognition to say, space possesses extension, or fire possesses heat.
Ah, we automatically split the universe into things and descriptions of things.
Precisely. The moment you utter the phrase space possesses extension, your brain has subtly, unconsciously created two completely separate entities.
It hallucinated an extra thing.
It has hallucinated a foundational thing called space, and a separate property called extension that the thing somehow owns, carries, or holds. We automatically assume there is a core, silent entity hiding beneath the description.
We create a ghost.
Right.
We create this invisible mannequin, and then we dress it up in the clothing of heat or extension or solidity, and we think the mannequin is real.
That is a perfect analogy. The Abhidharma philosophers believed in the inherent existence of the mannequin.
Wow.
And that natural, automatic, dualistic separation is exactly what Nāgārjuna drops into the crushing machinery of the tetralemma.
The tetralemma, the fourfold logic gate. I love this part because in Western philosophy, we're so addicted to the simple dilemma, A or B, true or false, on or off.
It's very binary, yeah.
But Nāgārjuna uses this brutal four-cornered stress test to see if these spheres can actually hold up to the claim of inherent existence. Let's walk through how he uses verses 1 through 7 of Chapter 5 to dismantle the mannequin. Where do we start?
We start with the most intuitive assumption our minds make. The first corner of the tetralemma asks, are the irreducible element and its defining characteristic inherently different?
Are they completely separate? absolute entities.
Yeah.
So is the mannequin completely separate from the clothing?
Right. Nāgārjuna addresses this head-on in verse 1. He states that the irreducible element of space cannot possibly exist prior to or separate from its defining characteristic of extension.
Let's play devil's advocate for a second. Let's assume they are completely separate. What does that universe look like? What happens if the invisible fundamental element of space exists prior to the characteristic of extension?
Well, if the invisible basic component exists before any characteristic is applied to it, it means you have a fundamental building block of the universe floating around completely devoid of any features whatsoever.
No mass, no location, no extension, no energy, no charge.
Exactly. And a basic component without a characteristic has never been observed, posited, or rationally defended anywhere in the history of existence.
Because it's literally nothing.
It is a logical impossibility. An entity totally devoid of features cannot have existence anywhere. It wouldn't even be an invisible particle. It would be an absolute void. It's a non-entity.
It's like trying to find the concept of appleness without a shape, a color, a weight, or a taste. It's just empty air.
But the absurdity goes even deeper. Let's imagine somehow that they do exist inherently differently, that they possess completely closed-loop absolute essences.
Okay, I'm trying to picture that.
The element is locked in an absolute vault of generic elementness, and the characteristic is locked in an absolute vault of characteristicness.
Okay, I have a pure, featureless element on my left and a floating, disembodied property of extension on my right.
If they are inherently different with absolute boundaries, how do they ever interact? How does the characteristic ever apply itself to the element?
Well, they'd have to connect somehow.
But how? If they are inherently different, they share no common ground. If you say, oh, they have a relationship that connects them, well, what is that relationship? Is it a third inherently existing thing?
Oh, no.
Yeah. If so, how does that third thing connect to the first two? You need a fourth thing to connect the third and a fifth to connect the fourth. It triggers an infinite regress.
You can never bridge the gap. If things have absolute frozen borders, they can't touch, they can't influence each other.
Exactly. The defining characteristic has no basis to attach to. The act of characterization becomes completely impossible.
So it just breaks.
If difference were the absolute truth, we would be left with a completely undefined, non-functional, frozen universe. So, through pure logic, Nāgārjuna proves that the irreducible element and its defining characteristic absolutely cannot be inherently different or separate.
Okay, so corner one is a dead end. We shut that door. So the human mind, recoiling from that failure, naturally panics and violently swings to the exact opposite extreme. Which brings us to corner two, identity.
Yes. The mind says, fine, if they aren't separate, they must be exactly the same.
Are the invisible element of space and the characteristic of extension the exact same inherent thing? Let's unpack this, because on the surface, it almost sounds right.
It sounds like your earlier argument.
Yeah, it sounds like what I was arguing earlier, that the subatomic particle is just synonymous with its properties. But if the element and the characteristic are exactly identical, Nāgārjuna argues that the entire conceptual framework collapses into a logical tautology.
A total imploding tautology.
Why does it implode?
Because if the subject and the object are exactly identical in an absolute sense, the dynamic action of defining or characterizing vanishes.
The verb just disappears.
It's like trying to use an eye to look at itself. It's like trying to make a knife cut its own blade.
Or saying A equals A.
Exactly. If the element of space and the characteristic of extension are mathematically absolutely identical, then why do we even have two words?
Right.
The act of characterization becomes absurd. You lose the ability to make any distinctions whatsoever.
Because you can't have a defined and a definer if there's only one singular monolithic entity.
Nāgārjuna points this out brilliantly in verses 3 and 4. He shows that the dynamic process of defining cannot function if the entity is already perfectly defined by being identical to the characteristic.
And it obviously can function if the entity is undefined.
Right. The action of characterizing relies entirely on a subtle interplay, a relational gap between the subject and the object. If they are absolutely identical, there is no relationship. There is no space for the verb to happen.
So if they are identical, there is no defining. The triad just crushes in on itself into a singularity of nothingness. So corner two is shut. They are not identical.
Which leaves us scrambling.
Right. To the third corner of the tetralemma. Are they both identical and different at the same time?
This is a very common philosophical escape hatch. When faced with a paradox, people try to merge the two failures together and call it a profound mystery.
It's the ultimate cop-out. Oh, it's both. It's just a mystery. But Nāgārjuna doesn't let us get away with it. How does he dismantle both?
By pointing out that matching two logical fallacies together doesn't miraculously manufacture a truth. It's just cognitive dissonance masquerading as profundity.
I love that.
You cannot say a shape is completely a square and completely a circle in the exact same absolute sense at the exact same time.
Because if difference leads to an unbridgeable frozen universe, and identity leads to a tautological singular collapse, slapping them together just gives you a collapsed frozen absurdity. It fails twice as hard.
Yeah.
It's a contradiction in terms.
Precisely. If the element and the characteristic have an absolute nature, that nature cannot be self-contradictory. So the third door is locked.
Which leaves the mind desperately grasping at the fourth and final corner. Are they neither identical nor different?
And this is where the mind often tries to retreat into a mystical fog. They're neither this nor that, it's just beyond comprehension.
Oh, I've heard that one before.
But Nāgārjuna cuts this off too, claiming neither just plunges us into an unworkable, paralyzing nihilism.
How so? Why is neither nihilistic?
Because if you say they are neither identical nor different, you are essentially asserting that distinctions don't function at all. You are rejecting the entire framework of conventional reality.
Oh, because you're throwing out all relationships.
Yes. If there is absolutely no relationship of difference and no relationship of identity between the invisible basic components and their characteristics, we have absolutely no conceptual ground to stand on.
We wouldn't be able to tell the difference between fire and water. We wouldn't be able to distinguish between the element of earth and the element of consciousness.
Exactly. The functional biological world would be completely denied. We wouldn't be able to navigate reality. But since we clearly do navigate reality, since fire clearly does burn and water clearly does quench, the neither position must be false.
So we've walked through the fourfold logic gate, and we've locked all four doors behind us. The invisible basic component and its defining characteristic are not different. They are not identical. They are not both, and they are not neither. We have completely exhausted the conceptual grid.
And Nāgārjuna doesn't stop there. In verse 6, he takes this exact same tetralemma and applies it to the very concept of existence itself.
Wait, existence itself, how does that work?
He argues that the irreducible element of space cannot inherently exist, it cannot inherently not exist, it cannot do both, and it cannot do neither.
Let's trace that logic. If it inherently existed, meaning it stood completely alone, requiring nothing else to sustain its reality, it wouldn't need a defining characteristic to make it known. It would just be a glaring absolute reality.
Yes. And conversely, if it inherently did not exist, if it was an absolute void, how could a defining characteristic ever apply to nothingness?
You can't paint empty air. You can't put a label on a void.
Exactly. You cannot interact with absolute nothingness. It has no surface for a characteristic to adhere to. And verse 7 takes this massive sweeping negation of space and rigorously applies it to all the other dhatus.
Earth, water, fire, wind, consciousness.
Yes. Not a single fundamental building block of the universe can survive the stress test of the tetralemma.
So let's pull back and look at what this actually means. Because it's heady. We started with the assumption that at the very bottom of reality, there are these solid, dependable, invisible Lego bricks.
Right.
But since every single extreme position we can possibly take to describe how these bricks interact with their own properties leads directly to logical contradiction, absurdity, or an infinite regress, we are completely out of options.
Yeah.
The analytical mind just exhausts itself. It hits a brick wall at 100 miles an hour.
The conceptual mind shatters against its own limitations.
And when that shattering happens, we are forced to accept a radical, terrifying shift in how we view these subatomic foundations.
Which leads us to the inevitable conclusion of Nāgārjuna's diagnostic.
The conclusion is the realization of emptiness, because of the three spheres of characterization. The defining characteristic, the act of characterizing, and the irreducible element cannot exist in any of those four absolute ways. They must be completely empty of inherent existence.
They're empty of svabhāva. Yes. They completely lack a standalone core. They are never absolute. And I want to emphasize how earth-shattering this was for the Abhidharma view, and how earth-shattering it is for our modern materialist view.
It's a total paradigm shift.
Nāgārjuna is proving that even the most microscopic, fundamental building blocks of our reality do not possess their own independent reality from their own side.
There is no solid, unchangeable rock bottom to the universe. Even the foundation is fluid.
It is entirely fluid.
But I know exactly how I felt when I first encountered this, and I suspect many listeners feel the same way right now. Hearing that the absolute foundation of your body, your brain, and your world is completely empty, it feels like falling into a dark void. It feels terrifyingly nihilistic.
It can definitely trigger a sense of conceptual vertigo.
Yeah, vertigo is a good word for it.
But that vertigo only happens if you mistake emptiness for nothingness. And Madhyamaka philosophy is very clear. Emptiness is not a void. Emptiness is the exact opposite of nothingness. Emptiness is what catches you when you fall.
Emptiness catches you. That is a brilliant way to frame it, because it leads us directly into the mechanism of how the universe actually works if there are no solid Lego bricks. Because they lack a solid core, because they are empty, they must be completely inseparable. They are dependently co-originated.
This is the sheer breathtaking elegance of the Madhyamaka system. The emptiness of the elements is exactly what allows them to be interdependent.
Oh, because they don't have rigid borders.
Right. If they were solid, they couldn't interact. Because they are empty, they can co-arise. They are co-defined, co-emergent, and they co-evolve.
Let's really drill down into the mechanics of this interdependence, because the text describes this as a limitless, centerless, fractal loop of definition. And I want to make sure we aren't just using buzzwords here. How exactly are these spheres co-imputed by the mind in a loop?
To understand the fractal loop, we have to completely abandon our linear way of thinking. In our normal, everyday, linear view of the world, we think chronologically. First, there is a basic element, say, an invisible particle of Earth. Second, our mind looks at it and applies a characteristic, like solidity. And third, we walk away with a defined element. A leads to B, leads to C.
A straight line on a timeline?
Exactly. But the fractal loop reveals that this straight line is an illusion. These three spheres, the element, the characteristic, and the action, are merely designations, conventional tools that are co-imputed by the mind simultaneously. And here is where the loop happens. The defined irreducible element, let's call it the product, instantly loops back to become a new defining characteristic, the producer, for the very next moment of perception.
Wait, I need a concrete example for that. How does the product become the producer? How does the result of a definition suddenly become the lens for the next definition?
Let's use the element of consciousness because it's the dhātu we experience intimately every second. Consciousness is the irreducible element, and let's say its defining characteristic is awareness or cognition. They co-arise. You cannot possibly have consciousness without awareness, and you cannot have awareness without consciousness.
They're mutually dependent.
But the moment your mind imputes this definition, the exact microsecond you experience the reality of, I am aware of the sound, that very defined state of consciousness immediately becomes the new conditioning characteristic for your next moment of experience.
Oh, I see. The definition I just established becomes the filter through which I view the next millisecond of reality.
Precisely. If your moment of consciousness was defined by anxiety, that anxious consciousness loops back around and becomes the defining characteristic for how you perceive the next fundamental element you interact with. The defined object reshapes the defining characteristic, which in turn redefines the object.
It's an endless recursive feedback loop.
It is a continuous vibrating flux. There is no absolute first definition that started it all, no primordial original base layer, and there is no final absolute definition waiting at the end of time.
It's just a vast, centerless web of constant updates. Every single invisible basic component of the universe is just continuously bleeding into and defining every other component. That is staggering to think about.
It really is.
But acknowledging this profound emptiness without denying the fact that definitions are still conventionally useful, that's tricky. It requires a really delicate psychological balancing act.
It is a tightrope walk.
We have to hold two seemingly contradictory concepts in our minds at the exact same time, which brings us to the necessity of uniting the two truths.
The union of the two truths is the only way to balance it. We must recognize how the ultimate truth and the conventional truth function together, specifically regarding these three spheres of characterization.
Walk us through how they unite without canceling each other out.
The ultimate truth is their emptiness. It is the undeniable fact that the irreducible elements and their characteristics completely lack an independent, frozen essence. When you search for their absolute core, you find nothing.
And the conventional truth?
The conventional truth is their functionality. It is the undeniable fact that we still experience solidity, fluidity, heat, motion, and awareness. Fire still burns you, even if its fundamental particles are empty.
And the brilliance of Nāgārjuna is that he shows us these two truths aren't enemies. They aren't competing for dominance.
They are the exact same phenomenon viewed from two different angles. The ultimate truth of emptiness is precisely what allows the conventional truth of functionality to exist.
Because if things weren't empty, they'd be frozen.
Think about what would happen if the invisible basic components of our world actually possessed inherent existence. If the element of earth was permanently, inherently, absolutely solid to its absolute core, it could never interact with water to make mud.
Oh, wow.
It could never break down into soil. It could never be absorbed by the roots of a plant to become a tree.
If it had absolute borders, it would be a closed loop. A universe of inherently existing particles would just be an inert, frozen grid of disconnected dots. Causality would freeze entirely.
Yes. Life would be impossible. We can only categorize, define, and successfully navigate the invisible basic components of our world because they are fluid, permeable, and empty of rigid, frozen boundaries.
So the appearance relies on the emptiness.
The appearance of the defined element is its emptiness, and its emptiness is what allows the appearance.
It's a beautiful paradox, and it sets up this deeply poetic conclusion that the texts arrive at. Because these foundational elements and their defining characteristics are dependently arisen and ultimately empty, the three spheres are essentially like illusions.
Yes, illusion.
The ancient sources use these stunningly evocative descriptions. They say, reality is like a reflection in a mirror, a mirage in the desert, a dream, or an echo. And I find the echo analogy particularly helpful. It grounds all this high-level logic into a sensory experience we can actually relate to.
The echo is perhaps the most accurate visual and auditory metaphor for dependent origination.
Let's explore it. Imagine you are standing on the edge of a massive, jagged canyon, and you shout out into the void. Conventionally, that echo functions flawlessly. The sound wave leaves your throat, it physically travels through the air, it bounces off the specific geometry of the canyon walls, it travels back to your ear, and you hear it clearly.
Right.
It might even physically startle an animal in the canyon into taking flight. It has a real, undeniable causal impact on the conventional physical world.
Unquestionably, it functions. It produces a result.
But if you were to climb down into that canyon and try to physically grab the absolute core of that echo with your bare hands, what would happen? Your hand just closes on empty air, it slips right through your fingers.
You can grasp.
You cannot locate the echo's inherent core because it doesn't have one.
Yeah.
It is a dependently originated event. It relies entirely on the origin of the shout, the temperature of the air, the atmospheric pressure, the specific jagged shape of the rock walls.
It is a confluence of conditions, an interdependent event, not an independent thing.
Right. It is there, yet not there. And Nāgārjuna is telling us that the absolute fundamental subatomic building blocks of our universe, the very definitions of space, earth, water, and consciousness, operate exactly like that echo. They function perfectly to create the vivid reality we experience, but if you tried to conceptually or physically grab their absolute core, you grab empty air.
That is an excellent summary of the illusory nature of the dhātus. But I must issue a very strict urgent warning here, which the texts themselves emphasize heavily.
A warning?
Yes. When the dualistic human mind finally realizes that everything, even the most fundamental building blocks of physical reality, is just an ungraspable echo, it tends to panic. The ego hates ambiguity. It hates groundlessness.
It wants the jagged white line on the x-ray back. It wants something to hold on to.
Desperately. And so the panicked mind will often try a very sneaky, dangerous trick. It will try to take the concept of emptiness itself or the concept of the illusion and freeze that into a new absolute reality.
Turn it into a new foundation.
Yes. It will try to turn the medicine into a new religion.
Wow. So the mind says, okay, the elements aren't real, but emptiness is the true, solid, absolute reality of the universe.
Exactly. We try to reify the lack of reification. We grasp the cure as if it were a new solid object. And if you do that, Nāgārjuna says, you are incurable.
That's a strong word. Incurable.
Because you've turned the medicine into poison. To prevent us from falling into this subtle trap, to stop us from worshiping the concept of emptiness, we must deploy the generalized tetralemma.
The generalized tetralemma. This is where we take the fourfold logic gate we used earlier, but we expand it to its absolute universal limits.
We push it until the entire conceptual grid of human thought shatters entirely. We use the generalized tetralemma to forcefully affirm that the three spheres, the element, the characteristic, and the defining, are not this, they are not non-this, they are not both, and they are not neither.
And the kicker is?
And the crucial, devastating kicker is for whatever this happens to be.
For whatever this happens to be. That phrase is a cognitive bulldozer. It covers literally every single noun, every verb, every abstract concept, every philosophy my brain can possibly conjure up to defend itself.
It is a total, relentless exhaustion of the conceptual grid. It forces the mind to permanently stop categorizing reality altogether. You cannot categorize the fundamental elements as existent. You cannot categorize them as non-existent.
You can't categorize them at all.
You cannot categorize them as dual or non-dual. You can't even categorize them as empty or not empty.
You are stripping away every single linguistic and conceptual tool in my toolbox. You're leaving me with absolutely nothing to hold on to.
I am.
Which naturally brings up a massive existential dilemma. If you strip away all my cognitive tools, if I can't use this or non-this to describe the basic components of my own body and the physical world around me, what on earth should my attitude be? How do I physically and mentally orient myself to reality?
This is where we arrive at the middle way. The middle way is not a compromise. It is not a lukewarm point halfway between two extremes.
It's not just the center.
No. It is a radical state of being that is entirely free from all extremes. It is free from this, it is free from non-this, and crucially, it is free from the muddy middle ground of both, or neither.
So what does the middle way actually cure? What is it actively fighting against in our daily lives?
It serves as the complementary antidote to the two great sicknesses of human philosophy and psychology. The first sickness is eternalism.
Naive realism.
Yes. It's the desperate belief that the subatomic particles, the dhātus, are permanently solid, that they have fixed, frozen, absolute borders that last forever.
It's the belief that the X-ray is the ultimate, objective truth of the universe.
Yes. And the middle way cures eternalism by demonstrating the ultimate emptiness of all phenomena.
Okay, what's the second sickness?
The second great sickness is nihilism. This is solipsism, or extreme idealism. It's the dark, despairing belief that because things lack inherent existence, nothing matters. Morality is a joke, nothing functions, and nothing exists at all.
It's the belief that the echo isn't even worth listening to, because it's just empty air.
Exactly. The middle way cures nihilism by demonstrating the flawless, beautiful functionality of dependent origination. So, when you rest in the middle way, you neither accept nor reject the spheres in absolute terms.
You don't fiercely accept them as solid gods, and you don't angrily reject them as meaningless hallucinations. You rest in the dynamic, vibrant tension between the two.
Yes, perfectly said.
I understand the theory of that, but I have to ask the ultimate pragmatic question here. Because if this philosophy doesn't translate to daily life, it's just academic wordplay.
Fair enough.
If we don't accept or reject these invisible components in absolute terms, if we can't conceptually categorize them as this or that, how do we, as people living in the modern world, actually interact with physical reality tomorrow morning?
Give me a specific scenario.
Okay, tomorrow morning I wake up, I walk into the kitchen to make breakfast. I am interacting with water, heat, the solidity of the counter. If the subatomic elements composing the stove and the water are ungraspable echoes, how do I boil an egg without having a paralyzing existential crisis? Do I just stare at the stove?
That brings us to the profound psychological posture of conventional use. The ancient texts describe this posture as acting without acting.
Acting without acting. That sounds like a Zen riddle.
It sounds paradoxical, but it is deeply practical. It means we use these three spheres. We use definitions, we use characteristics, and we use the fundamental elements conventionally, but never in absolute terms. We use them as provisional tools.
So it's still turn on the stove.
Yes, you absolutely turn on the stove. You engage with the physical world. You use the concepts of solidity, heat, and space to cook your breakfast. But you use them without attachment, without reification, without desperate conceptual effort, and without absolutes.
We use the tools without believing the tools are the ultimate reality.
Exactly. You still cook the breakfast. You still drive the car. You engage fully, compassionately, and passionately with the conventional world, but you do it while continuously, viscerally knowing its true, empty, interdependent nature.
You navigate the illusion skillfully without being crushed by the weight of believing the illusion is a permanent, solid trap.
That's the essence of it.
This concept of acting without acting perfectly aligns with the famous raft analogy from the Buddhist sources. I think bringing that in here illustrates this dynamic beautifully.
The raft analogy is essential here.
Imagine you were standing on the shore of a raging, dangerous river. That river represents your own confusion, your anxiety, your desperate grasping at solid things in a fluid world. You know you need to cross the river to survive. So you build a heavy, intricate wooden raft. This raft represents the heavy logic we've been using today, the triad of characterization, the tetralemma, the two truths, all this dense, rigorous philosophy.
It is a highly functional, vital tool for crossing the water.
Right. You use the heavy logic to cross the river of confusion. It keeps you from drowning in nihilism or being swept away by eternalism. But once you finally reach the far shore of understanding, would you truly perceive the empty, echoing nature of reality and step onto dry land? You don't heave that massive, heavy wooden raft onto your back and carry it with you through the forest for the rest of your life.
No, you would be completely crushed by the weight of your own philosophy. You would become a fundamentalist of emptiness.
Exactly. You don't walk around the grocery store muttering about the tetralemma of the subatomic particles in an avocado.
Yeah.
You drop the philosophy. You leave the heavy raft of concepts on the shore and you walk freely. You use the definition to get free, and then you drop the definition.
That is the absolute essence of acting without acting. And dropping that conceptual raft is what finally allows us to reach the culmination of the universal Madhyamaka diagnostic. The final realization.
Primordial oneness.
Once you are fully released from the tyrannical grip of conceptual grasping, once you stop aggressively forcing the fluid universe into rigid, binary boxes of element and characteristic, a profound shift in human perception occurs.
Everything shifts.
You conclude that you might as well perceive everything, including these three spheres, as primordially equal, pure, perfect, complete, divine, and one.
Okay, we need to issue a massive flashing warning sign here regarding the word one. We rigorously clarified the danger of extremes earlier, but we must reiterate it here regarding oneness. One is used strictly in the non-dual sense.
Yes. It means not many, not one, not both, and not neither.
Right, because if we just casually say everything is one, the modern listener's mind might instantly default back to New Age monism. We might start thinking, oh, so reality is just one giant featureless cosmic soup where all distinctions melt away.
Which is completely wrong.
The boundary between my hand and a glowing red-hot stove is totally fake, so I should just press my hand against the coil because we're all just the same blob of oneness.
And that is a catastrophic, physically dangerous misunderstanding of Madhyamaka. If monism were true, the conventional universe would break, biological existence would shut down.
Right.
If the invisible basic components of the fire and the invisible basic components of your hand were the exact same undifferentiated soup, a burn could not occur. Interaction requires conventional boundaries.
So it's not a featureless gray soup.
Not at all. It is a vibrantly colorful, luminous, interdependent web. The oneness we are talking about is the shared emptiness.
Shared emptiness. I love that phrasing.
It is the shared, interdependent nature of every single unique, vivid thing in the universe. Conventional boundaries function perfectly. The fire will absolutely still burn the hand, but absolute, inherently existing boundaries do not exist anywhere.
Everything is primordially equal and pure, precisely because everything is equally empty and equally interdependent.
Yes, a particle of dirt and a particle of gold are primordially equal because neither possesses an absolute core. They are just different echoes in the same canyon.
It's breathtaking. Let's take a moment to really reflect on the staggering scope of this journey we've just taken. We started with Chapter 5 of the MMK.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We took the absolute, invisible, fundamental building blocks of reality, the dhātus, and their defining characteristics. We started with the assumption that they were solid, independent Lego bricks of the universe.
The assumption of inherent existence, the X-ray we wanted to believe in.
But then we ran them through the relentless machinery of the tetralemma. We logically proved that the element and the characteristic couldn't be entirely different. They couldn't be completely identical. They couldn't be a messy combination of both, and they couldn't be neither. We revealed that these foundational subatomic components are entirely empty of a solid core.
We saw that they are dependently co-arisen. They are co-imputed by the mind in a limitless, centerless fractal loop where the product constantly updates to become the new producer of reality.
We recognize that they are exactly like echoes in a canyon, functionally real on a conventional level, but totally ungraspable on an ultimate level. We used the generalized tetralemma to completely exhaust our linguistic and conceptual grid, forcing ourselves to step off the ledge into the middle way.
We learned what it means to act without acting, using the conceptual tools as a raft to cross the river, and then having the courage to leave the raft on the shore.
And finally, we transcended the concepts entirely to rest in the realization that the universe is a primordially pure, luminous, interdependent web where everything is non-dually away. We literally took apart the grammatical and physical assumptions of reality and found total liberation in the flux.
It is the ultimate surgical extraction of human anxiety. We spent an hour meticulously proving that there are absolutely no floorboards for the ego to stand on, only to realize we never actually needed a floor to begin with. The falling is the flying.
Incredible. But before we sign off today, I want to leave you, our fellow learner, with one final, deeply provocative challenge. A thought experiment for you to chew on and explore entirely on your own, building on everything we've just discussed.
The ultimate test of bringing ancient philosophy into modern daily life.
Exactly. Tomorrow morning, when you wake up and interact with the physical world, when you pour your coffee, when you tap the steering wheel of your car, when you look at the solid objects surrounding you, knowing now that they are composed of these invisible, ungraspable, empty basic elements. I want you to try to observe the exact microsecond in your mind before it imputes a defining characteristic onto reality.
Try to catch the machinery of the mind in the act of building the illusion.
Yes. Before your brain slaps the label of solidity onto the steering wheel, before it defines the element of space between you and your computer screen, what actually exists in that silent, terrifying, completely unlabeled gap before the definition happens? Who or what are you in the fraction of a millisecond before the jagged white line is drawn on the X-ray of your reality?
That silent gap is where true, unconditioned freedom lives.
We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. It takes immense intellectual courage to let the fundamental assumptions of your universe be challenged and dismantled. We invite you to carry this non-dual awareness, this quiet practice of acting without acting, into the beautiful, empty, echoing canyon of your everyday life. See you next time.